Hey folks, so this week I'll be focusing on a series some of you viewers may already be familiar with, plausibly because I've already covered some of its earlier iterations. That's right, we're returning to DreadXP's gaming anthology, the DreadX Collection, with its newest entry, The Hunt. For those unfamiliar, the DreadX titles serve as a collaboration between a number of indie devs, striving to make scary titles that mesh with a given theme. Fittingly enough for The Hunt, which was co-produced by Dusk developer David Szymanski, the theme's a bit more action-oriented, as it tasked the developers with making horror-fueled shooters, potentially providing players with spooks and spent magazines. Still, that does beg the question. With such a large gamut of developer talent, were all the entries in The Hunt a bullseye? Or was it more of a hit-and-miss experience? I'm your host, Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Alright, now, for those familiar with the normal flow of these episodes, there is going to be a slight change, as I'll be providing a shorter blurb for each individual title. That said, I'll be kicking things off with The Hunt itself, given that it's a fully fleshed out game that also serves as a hub/vehicle for the other titles in the collection, and I'd be remiss if I didn't chat about it. But first, for the newcomers in the audience, welcome to the world of DreadX. Given that it's now the fourth title in a series with an interconnected narrative, I figure I owe some of you folks a blurb. It's been some time since the cognitovirus first began to run rampant, causing strange and altogether dangerous anomalies to crop up across the world. For some, this meant the end of everything. But for others, they learned to adapt, to survive the spreading insanity, to the point that life began to resume its normal course. Or at least, as normal as it could be, while there exists the real possibility of being lost in pocket dimensions, devoured by malignant entities, or simply mutating into creatures heretofore unknown to man. And that's just Monday. In fact, you can tune into a radio show to hear just how weird everything has gotten.
Hello? Folks, I know this show is explicitly for entertainment purposes only, but if you want my non-legally binding advice, stock up on some ramen and beans. You never know when you'll find yourself in a pocket dimension. Which
brings us to The Hunt. Suffice to say, figuring out how to merely eke out an existence as the world went to hell was hardly enough for some. Hence the formation of the ARC-2 research base. It's here, squirreled away within the Arctic, that a team strove to figure out a solution to the virus ravaging the world. And yet, our arrival is not in the familiar shoes of the game's original protagonist. Rather, we don the role of series newcomer Artemis, who's been tasked to make contact with the base after communication was mysteriously lost. And it takes very little time to realize that something sinister has occurred. Okay, introduction aside, the story's essentially fed to you one portion at a time, through a combination of Artemis's thoughts, the recordings she finds in the base, and some scattered texts. It's a generally pretty enjoyable journey, though there's a tiny bit of jank for some of her voice lines in that you can cause her to repeat the audio triggers. On the gameplay side of things, you'll be progressing through some light adventure-style shenanigans, finding items and using them to unlock portions of the base. While not challenging, they do seek into some solid bits of storytelling and ambient creepiness. That said, in order to advance, you'll occasionally need to fetch one of the PC passwords left within the ARC's anomaly reports. This is pretty straightforward, as you have access to all of them from practically the beginning. Essentially, using one activates the game associated with the report. Though, if you find yourself not having a good time, simply booting up the game serves to unlock the associated password, making the free play mode essentially moot unless you're really adverse to playing the Hunt's hub game. All in all, I found this segment to be charming and fairly solid. Yeah, there were some elements that were rough around the edges, but it never overstayed its welcome, and there were some pretty neat moments, even if the veneer of spookiness could be peeled away if you're a gremlin like me. Still, this segment, it was a hit to me. Moving on, the first dossier I dived into was Philip Hesselback's Axismundi, which puts you in the shoes of a spiritual photographer investigating a super haunted locale. Like, to the point you wind up being dragged through a series of lethal reenactments of its horrific history. Good stuff. As for the mechanics, well, if you've played or seen Fatal Frame, this will feel similar, albeit a bit more simplistic. Essentially, you roam about the area, solving a few puzzles, and snapping photos at ghosts in order to exorcise them. And if you're an idiot like me and playing hard, you will find yourself sorely tasked, since not only are your enemies fairly lethal, your camera has a hefty recharge time, so expect to alternate between sprinting in circles, firing off rapid photos, and just cowering occasionally. Cowardice is a legitimate strategy here, since you can avoid projectiles by skulking behind objects, which helps for a certain spooky boss encounter. But I digress, since there's also stuff here for the less combat inclined. Like I mentioned, there is difficulty options to help you go through, and there's a few puzzles to engage in which are fairly enjoyable, alongside an entirely optional objective that sees you trying to recreate a set of photos in order to unlock lore. I may have gone out of my way to get all of them, but it works, since I had a lot of fun and the game never felt like it was overstaying its welcome. Overall, this title was a hit for me. After that, I moved on to Dan McGrath's The House of Unrest, which follows a priest's quest to exorcise a possessed peer. That said, there's more to this demon than meets the eye, and it's not long before its evil seeps into the mansion you're mired in. And yet, while the corruption festers in the walls and walks the hallways, hope is far from lost. After all, this padre is packing. I guess the logic is, thou shalt not kill doesn't really apply to undead / weird flesh monsters. Anyways, as far as the execution goes, House of the Unrest is fairly relaxed, given you have unlimited ammo and a fairly quick reload time. Frankly, I'd probably place the game as more of a puzzle adventure with FPS elements, given the majority of the antagonists don't feel like much of a threat. Mostly, there were a couple harrowing moments where I wound up dealing with an enemy in major close quarters or overlooked an ambush, but those wound up being less of an issue when I realized that your handy-dandy cross not only served to clear away corruption, it also serves as a flashlight and helps to illuminate darkened areas. Nice. Anyways, as an overall experience, I've found it to be good fun. The core mechanics make for a quick, enjoyable romp, I dug the puzzle exploration elements, and it had an unexpected but altogether epic conclusion that I don't want to spoil, but it's great. Seriously. House of Unrest is a hit, so just go give it a spin. Next up on the playthrough was Kira's Luketana 64, which notably pays homage to the aesthetic of the N64, complete with nostalgic-inducing load screen. Just, God, rumble packs. I remember those. Anyways, Luketana follows a redneck who's recently found himself employed by the CDC. Air quotes, the CDC. Specifically, he's tasked with gunning down some local wildlife and taking photos of their still warm corpses for reasons. Maybe. That job letter is a little more than suspect, as is the overall state of the wildlife you encounter, given its straight up nightmare fuel. That said, if you want to piece together the truth, you'll need to venture deeper into the woods and hope that someone has documented it. Gameplay-wise, Luketana is a surprisingly tense FPS, having you roam about in a relatively desolate area, doing your best to track down and then gun down infected fauna when you come across it before photographing their carcasses. Each stage focuses on a certain type of animal, and yet, while the premise might seem arcadey, it wound up being disconcerting, and not just due to the grotesque appearance. There's something altogether off-putting about the way in which I wound up hunted or ambushed by these things, and even just the way how seemingly mundane creatures would behave in just grotesque ways. It's really uncanny, which led to some pretty heavy bits of mood whiplash whenever you pull out your camera, not just because of the whole photography thing. Frankly, the way that the game requires you to focus in on the wildlife adds to the overall horror. No, what threw me for a loop was the fucked up enthusiasm the redneck has for his work. It's just grimly hilarious and serves to highlight just how naive and unprepared he is.
Make me smile.
That, and it just also helps to wind down the tension so the game can go back to messing with you again. Ultimately, I think it works out rather well. There's some decent storytelling, environmental and otherwise, and a solid set of adversaries to overcome. And the game doesn't fall flat at its conclusion either. All in all, I can safely recommend Luketana as a hit. Which, brings us to Christopher Yabsley's The Fruit. This is the first time I've played one of his games, though some of you folks may recognize him as the developer of the game Pigsaw. In any case, The Fruit puts us in the role of one Thomas Whitaker, who finds himself journeying deep into the rural countryside after an unexpected letter from an estranged lover. That said, upon arriving, it's not long at all before he discovers things are gravely amiss due to the feverish cult of deranged town folks and the cursed fruit which rests at the center of their fervent beliefs. In fact, there's barely any time at all before he's forced to tangle with occult forces, even as he does his best to try and discover where his lover factors into all of this and how to find him. Summary aside, I friggin' love this game's story beats. There is some genuinely unsettling moments that crop up with some great scenes and just altogether excellent ambience. One of the big ones that sticks out to my mind happens really early on, and I was so possessed with dread, I found myself dragging my heels to advance the story. It had me that unnerved. The background lore you can also discover in this is pretty enjoyable and made exploring around just feel rewarding. There's also a pair of endings, but this is a less involved process than you might think, given it mostly pertains to a decision you make at the end, and there's nothing stopping you from making the other choice right after. Also, as far as mechanics go, this game is a treat. I played The Fruit on both normal and hard, and it's legitimately challenging. See, while it's technically an FPS, you're using an old school rifle, which in itself is slow enough to reload normally, but made even more challenging because you need to reload it manually, and it only chambers a single bullet. It is hard to describe the tension I felt when I was busy backpedaling from an axe-wielding cultist while frantically trying to fumble a bullet. Either because I already blew the brains out of one of his buddies, or worse, because I got startled and missed my initial shot. Because yes, not only do you have to manually reload, you have a fairly sparse amount of max ammo. Thankfully, you do have a melee option that's pretty good at dispatching enemies, and stealth is an option for avoiding or axing your foes. But yeah, things get tense, especially if you wind up getting ambushed and eating a bullet. Suffice to say, my time with hard mode was rough, and I was made full use of the way that checkpoints heal you to full. Though, on the note of checkpoints, they only save that session. If you fully quit the game, you'll be starting from scratch, which I wound up finding out because I somehow managed to wedge myself into a spot like an idiot that actually prevented me from jumping or moving around. Here's the thing though, even despite the fact that this meant I had to restart, I was still having a blast. The Fruit is just solid as far as experiences go. The combat's lovely, the stealth elements are fun, there's great exploration, the narrative is just lovely, and there's even some light puzzle solving and platforming to be had, and I just love it so much. All the ambience, the narrative, even the there was only one segment of the game I was really iffy on, since it involves some really annoying floating skulls you need to dispel by flicking through a book rapidly, but that was blissfully short-lived. At the end of the day, I just really wish there was more of The Fruit to play. I would have really loved to see an expanded game with the same sort of mechanics and vibe, which is why The Fruit was a crit hit to me and stands out as a highlight in this collection. And then we come off to the next entry, and would it be Dread X if there wasn't an entry by Torpilduke? Probably, but they are a series mainstay. This time around, their contribution comes in the form of Black Relic. In it, you take the role of Brother Silence, a member of a secretive order of monks tasked with protecting the titular relic from the forces of darkness. Obviously, this all goes to shit within a matter of minutes, but before hell breaks loose, I did get to mill about the monastery, chatting with my peers, and finding out that a few were indulging in ye olde holy spirits. Now, that's a creative use of the communion wine. Anyways, once things are on fire, it's about that point you get introduced to the crux of Black Relic's core gameplay, and the first thing that stuck out to me is the darkness. Visibility is just outright low, to the point that oftentimes the only thing hinting at an enemy will be its glowing eyes. thankfully, that's about all you need, really. I mean, yes, you could whip out the lantern to make sure that it is, in fact, a goat-headed monster coming your way, but your time is better spent with the crossbow since the game hurls small arenas worth of enemies at you. Don't turn on the Doom music just yet, however, or if you do, dial back its speed, since Black Relic just winds up feeling, well, slow. Instead of a fast-paced FPS, the enemies in Black Relic alternate between slowly sauntering over towards your position or sniping at you from safe locations. Inversely, your choices are just to briskly jog away from them and fire the occasional set of arrows their way. It's a whole thing. Honestly, the tensest moments are where you're forced to reload during combat, given that animation takes forever to execute. And yet, while it can get sucked to smack, you do have the ability to pray the pain away, which is also likewise a slow animation, but it's frankly forgiven, given that it renders you effectively immortal in the long run. And this essentially remains the same even when the game introduces a pair of boss encounters, which is probably why I felt such an ambivalence towards this title. Like, I appreciate the aesthetic elements, even if I did manage to mess with the graphics in a hilarious way that had me seeing the underworld. And I ultimately dug the game's narrative, as it provided a few neat surprises along the way, alongside some references to Hand of Doom. And yet, for such a combat-centric game, it felt tedious, which is why I ultimately rate it as a fumble. Then there's... man... even going back to this is fucking weird. Right, so, welcome to Mr. Pink's Rose of Meat, a grotesquely weird FPS I don't even know how to properly summarize. Let's see. So, you're on a fishing trip that goes amiss, and you wind up shipwrecked on an island that may as well be a dumping site for an abattoir. Just meat everywhere. He is then obliged to undergo a set of fetch quests in order to find his way out. And he's armed with a useless pistol and a talking club made out of someone's foot. It's definitely an experience of the sort that made me wonder if I was sleep deprived when playing it, but no, all of that actually happened. Still, as much as the story is surreal sort of fever dream, it does manage to be pretty unsettling in its execution. The world is unpleasant to be in, and while there are NPCs to talk to, even that is a disconcerting experience more often than not. Playing it, however, is, well, it's still uncomfortable, but for a different reason. The best way I can describe it is deliberately janky. See, there's obstacles and enemies you'll need to bypass in road, and yet while you're armed with a pistol, it is garbage. I mean, shooting at a wall of meat would be pretty useless. Instead, you need to whack things with your meat club in order to summon up explosive meat lumps, which can then be detonated to actually kill things. Conceptually, it's weird and morbid, but in execution, it's awkward. You need to make sure that you give yourself enough time for things to grow before the enemy gets to you, and even then, the eyeball you need to shoot to detonate can oftentimes be left obscured by oversized and weirdly moving enemies, or clip straight into objects, or just facing away you towards the enemy. Like, the boss battle for this one was a pain in the ass. Frankly, if I wasn't forced into combat, I avoided it as much as possible. Not that dying had much of a penalty, really, especially since you just heal by talking to most things. It's just running was generally the best use of my time, preferably while carrying the revolver because it's awesome spinning animation. That said, I will give the game credit. The Forest Witch segment, while a bit aggravating, also provided the most harrowing bits of gameplay you'll encounter, and some unscripted scares that had me absolutely hating life. But it wasn't enough to salvage Rose of Meat for me. Like, I could appreciate its uncomfortable ambience and the ideas it presents, but there's so many segments in the game that are more irritating than enjoyable, and the conclusion was just altogether unsatisfying. That's not to say it doesn't have merits, but it was definitely more of a mixed bag for me, which is why I rated it as a fumble. And that leaves us with our final title for this collection, namely Abby Smith, Aaron Wise, and Vitus Games' Ceres Fixial. I probably butchered that word. Anyways, Things kick off with the game reading off a note from your missing daughter. Well, that, and you being dumped on a bleak and desolate island so that you can enjoy an empty-feeling walking segment. One that also feels supremely unnecessary since you're only there to catch a boat so that you can transition to a submarine in the middle of the ocean so that you can descend an unnaturally long ladder into a weird cave full of alien growths. Anyways. Once inside, you'll begin the arduous task of actually trying to find your daughter. Arduous not due to the number of enemies the game tosses at you, there is a lot though, but rather the hellish nightmares noise that accompanies them spawning in. I couldn't ram an axe into their face fast enough hoping that I could get it to end a second sooner. Well, until the game offered me guns. See, not only do guns help to facilitate faster fodder fire, it also meant I didn't have to get up in the grill of those weird fucking sunflowers made of human body parts and feet. Yeah, as much as I have a lot of gripes, I have to admit that the visual design for those enemies made me supremely goddamn uncomfortable. It's just gross. Anyways, difficulty-wise, it's a fairly straightforward experience with only a few fights really sporting any sort of challenge or necessitating the use of the healing item the enemies drop. There are a few guns to collect, but you can comfortably skirt through almost all of the earlier encounters with a combination of the axe and the pistol. The boss encounters do at least provide something different from their peers, but it's a lot of just mediocrity between them, and you're still plagued by the noise of enemies spawning in. Also, I think the primary reason I found myself getting killed was actually getting wedged between an enemy and a wall and not being able to leave if it had too much health. Cough, last boss, cough, fuck you. Also, as far as ambience go, while there are a few moments where the game tries to be creepy, it really fucked it up for me by trying to jump scare me. Like, it starts the process of building up something spooky only to get impatient and try to elicit a spook it doesn't deserve, or can't quite muster due to the weird sound design inducing a perpetual state of annoyance. This gets a fail from me. Like, not only is the ending just mediocre, the entire game was just not enjoyable for me from start to finish. Anyways, that's, we've done it. We've reached the end of this review, and as far as things go, my experience with Dread X The Hunt was, by and large, quite positive. The hub game was a lot of fun to go through, and definitely helped to progress the overarching story of the game's share, and it has me hyped for what comes next due to the stinger. Oh, and the overall selection of games was generally a lot of fun and pretty varied, even with the shared genre. So, I would say that this collection as a whole is a solid hit for me, so you can probably expect me to cover what comes next, because I clearly haven't learned my lesson about writing long-ass reviews. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you have interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, a link in the description. You should become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Also, if you want to see me doing the legwork of going through these games live, I do stream over at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. With all that said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.